We spent several weeks looking at this idea of managing our lives to live successfully. You say, I want my life to be more successful. I'd like to manage my life better so that God would look at me and say, yes, I'm proud of this servant. And I could look at God and say, I'm a servant that he's proud of. And so for 2 weeks, we've looked at this idea. And 2 weeks ago, we looked all throughout the Bible. There's a plethora of scriptures that talk about the benefits of a lifestyle of biblical stewardship. And we spent a week on that. And we learned that we should be rivers and not reservoirs. We should allow God's blessings to pass through us and be moved on to the people in our circles of influence. And then last Sunday, we really, if you boil it all down, we looked at balance. We looked at balance last Sunday. We looked at the balance as a steward in using the resources that God is giving us and managing them for Him, whether we have many or whether we have few. And we're going to find out today that that really doesn't matter to God. What really matters to Him is what we do with what we have. And in that vein of thought, throughout America's history, many great men have believed that. If you keep up with your history and you look back over the years at the people that have been a part of the American foundational shaping through their service and through their ideas and their concepts, many of them truly and firmly believed that they were stewards of God's blessings upon their lives. And one famous man is Daniel Webster. How many of you have ever heard of Daniel Webster? He's one of the most famous, if not the most famous orator in American history. He was a statesman, and he was at a banquet that was honoring him, and it was attended by presidents and heads of states from all over the world. And someone asked him, Mr. Webster, what is the most profound thought that ever entered your mind? And his reply was this: the sense of my individual responsibility to God. The sense of my individual responsibility to God. He became deeply emotional at that point, and he excused himself and left the stage. And then when he recomposed himself, he came back out to speak for another 30 minutes to these great leaders from around the world of how responsible he felt in managing the things that God had given him. And if you know Daniel Webster, God gave him a lot to manage. And it was heavy on his heart that he do a good job of managing that. You're going to need to turn in your Bibles to Matthew 25 to track along with us today. Matthew 25, and that's the point of our sermon for this morning. If we were to look at this series of managing our lives and living successfully as traversing a mountain and then coming back down on the other side, look at me just for a second. Today we'd reach the top of the mountain, okay? And then we would enjoy the descent on the other side of the mountain over the next couple of weeks, which we'll talk about when we get to them. But our point for today is having the passion in our hearts to feel responsible and to individually manage the resources that God has given us, the things He's given us. And we're going to use the biblical parable of the steward and the talents. How many of you have ever read or heard this story, the parable of the talents from the Bible? Okay, that's where we're going to be today. And from this story, we're going to extrapolate 4 principles of money management. But first, let's read it. Matthew 25, beginning in verse 14. And it says this: it is just like a man going on a journey. He called his own slaves and turned over his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his own ability. Then he went on a journey immediately. And immediately the man who had received 5 talents went, put them to work, and earned 5 more. In the same way, the man with 2 earned 2 more. But the man who had received 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The man who received 5 talents approached, presented 5 more talents, and said, Master, you gave me 5 talents. Look, I've earned 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Share your master's joy. Then the man with 2 talents also approached him, and he said, Master, you gave me 2 talents. Look, I've earned 2 more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Share your master's joy. Then the man who had received 1 talent also approached and said, Master, I know you're a difficult man, reaping where you haven't sown and gathering where you haven't scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went off and I hid your talent in the ground. Look, you have what is yours. But his master replied to him, you evil, lazy slave, if you knew that I reap where I haven't sown and gather where I haven't scattered, then you should have at least deposited my money with the bankers, and when I returned, I would have received my money back with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have more than enough. But from the one who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. And throw this good-for-nothing slave into the outer darkness, in that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Father God, again, as we approach your throne today, and through your word we endeavor to learn more about you, to draw closer to you. God, we're sitting right here this morning waiting here for you to reveal yourself to us. Convict our hearts and souls, move us to the place to where we take action and we really fall in line with the ways in which you would have us manage our lives, so that you can look at us and say, enter your master's joy, good and faithful servant. You've done much with what I gave you. God, we want to live successfully for you. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray. And all God's people said. Okay, again, from this story, this parable, we're going to pull out 4 principles of money management today. And the first one, and I want you to ride along with me, track along today, because again, we've reached the mountaintop today. And it's important that we get today's message. Number 1, God owns it all. Now, we've said that before, but let me say it again. God owns everything. Don't fail to identify God's ownership of everything. Everything in your life, everything you see, touch, taste, smell, feel, all of those things are God's property, and He chooses to share His resources with others. How many of you have ever had a job where you had a company car? Okay, let's think about the company car for a second. As long as you're using that company car to better the business that owns that car, you're in good stead, right? You're using that car. How many of you had a company car you took home with you? I've had several of those over my lifetime. And as long as I was using that vehicle to further the business who provided that vehicle for me, I was golden. But I couldn't take it out and put a set of 22s on it, right? Very few of the, you know what I'm saying. You probably tried that, didn't you? He did, didn't he? There are those companies that might allow you to go out and change out the audio system in those. I'm a big music person. I've worked for companies that would allow that. I've worked for other ones that said, don't do anything to this vehicle. It's a fleet vehicle, and when you're done with it, I want to turn it back in as close as I can to the state in which you received it. Can you pack that thing up, put your family in it, and drive it off on vacation? Can you go out and paint Osceola's face on the hood because you want to make it look more like a Christian truck because it's what you believe in? Can you change the paint scheme on this thing? No. Just because the company provides this vehicle to you and allows you to use it, it doesn't make it your vehicle. You're just managing a resource that was provided to you by, for lack of a better phrase, your master, your employer. Let me say this a different way. Some people wrongly assume that God's property is theirs. So let me ask you this. Now, if you're not afraid, I want you by show of hands to answer this question if you can, or say it out loud. If you earned $400 last week, how much of it is God's? How many of you say 40? And I owe God 10% of my income. 40% of that $400 is God's. How many of you would say 400? If you said 40, I'm not doing a very good job. If everything is God's, and you earned $400 last week, how much of that $400 belongs to God? All of it. We're getting there. The steward knows that God owns everything. We just manage it. Get that word into your head. We are managing the things, the resources, the time, talent, and treasure that God has allotted to us, but it's all His. We're simply managers. And when we adopt this attitude, our actions will reflect true stewardship. God owns, I manage. End of story. Say it with me. God owns, I manage. End of story. Now, in this story, beneath this heading of God owns it all, there's 2 things that we can learn. And some of these I don't understand. For instance, the first one. It was the owner's right to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted with his talents. He got to distribute his resources however he wanted to. So some of y'all may be 5 talent people and you're like, yeah, the master's awesome. Love him. Some of you might be 1 talent people. You're like, man, I got it right in the shorts on this deal. Right? You say, well, that's not fair. I don't know about fair, but I can tell you that's how it works. God can do and will do whatever he wants with his resources. Now, we're all stewards. Let me tell you what you can guarantee is true for you. The steward had the responsibility. It was God's decision. It was the master's decision how he wanted to distribute his resources, but it was the steward's responsibility to manage them well. What I have, I'm handling for God, and it's his right to enter my life when he wants, how he wants, where he wants, and do whatever he wants with it. Job said this, say it with me, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That's the way that it works. Write this down. Listen to me. God has all the rights. We have all the responsibilities. Is your employer going to come out, jump in that company vehicle, and go out and do your work for you? No, the fact that they provided you with the training, with the tools, with the vehicle to get out there and do your job is all that you should expect from them. They provided you the resources. They have the rights. It's your responsibility to go and do your job. I wish America did a better job of learning that of late, because we've become entitled and enabled, and I'll preach another sermon if I am not careful, so let me stop before I chase that rabbit. But I would catch that bad boy if I decided I wanted to. But in time, here's the thing. The owner returned. Eventually, the owner comes back. And he called his stewards to him, and he asked them what they'd done in managing his resources. We will be called and asked the same questions. Remember that. So number one, God has all the rights. We have all the responsibilities. And number two, listen, God gives me resources to bring him glory and to grow his kingdom. God gives me resources to bring him glory and to grow his kingdom. So if you're writing down and taking notes, write this down. God-given resources are to accomplish God-given goals. Everything that God gives us is given to us for the express purpose of furthering his purposes in the world. There is no other answer to this. So in this story, I see that all that I have is God-given. I see that God gives different amounts of time, talents, and treasures to different people, and it's up to him how he does that. And then lastly, I see this. God has a right to hold me accountable. I will answer for what I do with what I have. The second big point to write down in these 4 points is this. Now, this is a tough one for folks. Look at me when I say this, because some of you are not going to agree with this. Every spending decision is a spiritual decision. They're like, oh, Stuart, you done went to meddling. You were preaching, you were doing just fine. Now you got all up in my business. All up in my business, right? Now you went to meddling. Well, let's look at this the right way. Here's what Ron Blue said. You can't fake stewardship. Your checkbook reveals all that you really believe about stewardship. A life story could be written from a checkbook. It reflects your goals, your priorities, your convictions, your relationships, and even the use of your time. A person who has been a Christian for a short time, a person who's been a Christian for an instant can learn to fake prayer, right? We can fake prayer. We can fake Bible study. We can fake evangelism. We can even fake going to church and so on. But you can't fake what your checkbook reveals. That's a spiritual document. Looking at our checkbook reveals where our values are. Is that probably not why so many of us are secretive about our own resources? I understand that. What does a fraud investigator do? If you have a company issue and there's some money that goes missing, a fraud investigator comes in, what do they follow? The money trail. A fraud investigator is going to come in and they're going to follow the money trail to discern whether or not a crime has been committed and whether you've extorted funds or whatever else. Here's what they're not going to do. They're not going to follow the verbal trail. They're not going to come in and say, oh, well, Michael Ann, what did you do with this? Well, what happened was, oh, well, we'll take your word for it. Check that off. That wasn't the problem. Not that you're, right? You're tracking with me. They're going to follow the money, and the money's going to lead them to the answers. You know what? Look at me. Jesus doesn't follow the verbal trail either. We can give lip service till the cows come home, but that ain't going to change anything. When Jesus wants to get to where our heart is, he follows our money trail as well, because you know what Jesus said? Where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be. He follows our money and finds our hearts, and this is a pretty sad thing, but when he follows our money, he finds out what we love and live for. He may be the only one in the universe that really knows, but he knows. So God uses these money and these possessions on this temporal earth, this temporary earth, to prepare us for his coming kingdom, his permanent kingdom. In verse 20, the man who had 5 talents said, look, see, I've gained 5 more. In verse 21, the master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Wouldn't you love to hear that? I'd love to hear that. I hope to hear that someday. The master said, look, since you did well with what I gave you on this temporary earth, I'm going to give you more than what you've had in the eternal coming kingdom. I'm going to hook you up in the next life because you did a good job with what you had in this one. You're a good steward. I can trust you. Then the one that received 2 talents, he come in verse 22, it says, look, see, I've gained 2 more. The master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Sounds like a party with invites. I love a party. And I have been known to crash them, but it's a whole lot better to be invited. Since you have handled the temporary things on this earth well, I have more responsibility and more blessings for you as you enter into my eternal kingdom. I will teach more specifically on this later because those mature Christians among you can follow the dots to where this leads and think, wait a minute, that's a sticky wicket. It is, but it's true. On a different date, we'll follow this train even further out, and we'll look at what our lives in eternity will look like based on what our lives in this life produce. That's why Jesus warned, look, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? If you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who's going to give you property of your own? What do you want to be, a trust fund brat? Yeah, sign me up. No, I'm kidding. Now, beneath this subheading of these spending decisions being spiritual decisions, let's look at 3 points that concern these money and possessions. And this is a good tool for all of us to learn no matter how young we are. Right, Hannah? This is something we could learn when we're really young. Number thing, let me tell you this. When God gives us possessions and money, he uses those in our lives as tools. God uses possession and money as tools, and he shapes our Christian life through these resources. You know why? Because they tend to get our attention. Huh? Yo. What gets your attention more than a financial setback in your life? That makes you stop and do a little evaluation, doesn't it? You know what maturity says when you have a financial setback in your life? It says, what do I need to learn from here? You know what immaturity says? God, what are you doing to me? It's a tool. The resources that God gives us are used by him as tools to shape us. They're also used as tests. God uses our money and our possessions as tests in our lives to see if we trust him and if he can trust us with more. Do you believe in proving yourself before you're given promotions? I got myself in trouble in previous ministries because we'd have a student ministry with a couple 100 kids in it. And we'd have these folks that came in and they knew everything. They were the cat's meow. They came in and they're pretty much like, man, you're lucky to have me. So great, I'm glad I have you. Grab that broom over there. Slice these pizzas. We got a system working and we vet our leaders here. So why don't you just get in here, roll your sleeves up and do what work is needed to be done. And if you do a good job with that, you won't believe how quickly we'll put you into something a little bit more taxing and trying. And you know what? The folks that took their marbles and went home because that was beneath them, we helped them find a new place to go because it certainly wasn't with us. If you're too proud to push a broom for Jesus, you take that up with him, but it ain't going to fly around here, right? We do what needs to be done when it needs to be done because we know that God is testing us to see if he can trust us with more time, talent, and treasure. Both of the good stewards were given more, and the bad steward had to give up what he had. Again, it becomes a test of the future kingdom. Or how many of you have ever heard those stories, the stories that say, okay, I went to heaven and St. Peter was there? Okay, this is not a theological statement. This is a story. But there was a very wealthy man who died and he was touring heaven and St. Peter was his guide. And he walked him through heaven and he showed him this huge mansion. And he goes, you know what? That belonged to your gardener. He's like, man, Shazam. Walked him a little bit further and said, hey, that belonged to that child missionary, that kid you knew that grew up to be a missionary in his life. He's like, woo, that is legit. Walked him on a little further, and there's a lean-to. You know what a lean-to is? Southern folks know what lean-tos are. If you ain't from around, you take two things, you lean them together. You lean two things together, and you keep your head dry. That's about the extent of it. Lean-to. And there's this 6x8 lean-to sitting on the back 40. And St. Peter said to the formerly wealthy man, he goes, well, there's your digs. Knock yourself out. There's your place. He's taken aback. He's like, wait a minute. The gardener got a mansion. The missionary got a mansion, and I get this. What's up? I don't get it. Why? And Peter looked at him and said, well, to be honest with you, we did the best we could with what you sent us. right? The things that God gives us are a test to see if he can trust us with more. And last thing I want you to know with this little sub-bracket is that God uses possessions and money as testimonies. Listen, a Christian may be the richest person on the block. A Christian may be the poorest person on the block. Hear me say this. Look at me for a second. That makes no difference in this world. We came in naked. We'll leave naked. We came in as dust, we'll leave as dust. You may be the poorest person on your block. You may be the richest person on your block. Let me say it again. Poverty and prosperity do not distinguish us as God's children. It does not distinguish his love for us. It has nothing to do with it. It's our attitude, whether we hold on loosely or hang on stubbornly to what we do have, that makes it obvious what kingdom it is that we live for. Was that clear as mud? Third big point. Not only is every spending decision a spiritual decision, hear me say this. This should make you be relieved. You should exhale right here. The amount is not important. The amount is not important. It's not the amount of possessions I can handle. It's how I handle the possessions that I have. The master to the servant who had doubled his 5, he said, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." Again, there's that great message. Well, what about in verse 23? That's verse 21. What about in verse 23 to the gentleman that doubled his 2? The master said exactly the same thing to him. There wasn't one message for the man with the 5 and another message for the man with the 2. The message was obviously exactly the same. So it also becomes obvious then that it doesn't matter to God whether we have a lot or a little. God doesn't care about that. The master was equally proud of the servant with 2 as he was with the servant with 5. It's in there. The amount's not important. God just wants you to be trustworthy with what you have. That should make you feel relieved. The widow's mite, a penny. And she's forever embossed in the story of God in the Gospels for giving a penny. We still talk about her today. Now think of the reasons that people give for not tithing. The rich people say, "Whew, I can't tithe. That's too big a number, man." Right? You may not have heard that, but I've heard that. Well, I used to give 10%, but then I really hit it. That number just got too big. It didn't make any sense anymore, so I started cutting back on it. And then the flip side of that is the ones who have very little can't tithe because they can't meet their bills. They're not good stewards and managers. God's interested in only one thing. What are we doing with what we have right now? That's it. The one who had 5 and grew it to 10, what did God say to him? Well done. The one who had 2 and grew it to 4, what did God say to him? Well done. The only person who didn't hear well done in this story decided not to use what he had. He decided to be stingy. He decided not to pass it on. He decided to bury it in the ground, which is the equivalent of this right here. Hide it. Nobody won't see it. I ain't got but one. Daggone, leave my one alone. It's mine, mine, mine. It's just as important to tithe on $200 a week as it is to tithe on $20,000 a week. And God, those are the same. And God wants us to learn that. Whatever we have, we must treat life with an open hand. 3 times more biblical space is committed to giving than to love, folks. He talks about our sacrificial giving 3 times more than love, which love is the whole expression of Jesus. And yet, how do you express your love without giving? 3 times more than love. 8 times more than belief, 7 times more than prayer. Remember that when you start worrying about whether or not God cares about your giving patterns or not. That's a very good rule of thumb. If the Bible mentions something a whole lot, we're supposed to get it. How many of you hate to repeat yourself? Don't you reckon God, when he got to about 2,113 times repeating this message, saying, "I wish they'd get this. I'm 215 deep on this thing right here." Number 4, write this down. Stewardship requires action. This is the scary part. The servant who had 1 talent knew and understood what he should do. Look at verse 24. If you're still in Matthew, look at verse 24 that says this. The man who received 1 talent came. Master, he said, what? I knew. I knew. I knew. He knew. What did he do in verse 25? He hid his talent. He knew what he was doing. He did it anyway. Now look in verse 26. But the master answered and said, "You wicked, lazy servant, so you knew?" Hold on. Let me get this straight. What you're saying is you knew what you were supposed to do and you chose not to do it? How'd that work out for him? We know the rest of the story. God took his talent away and gave it to the one who had 5 and doubled it to 10. Many of us lose time, talents, and treasure in our lives because we're flipping selfish. And we're not a river, we're a reservoir. Now let's close the net on this thing. Because what's interesting about this story of money management is that it also requires action from you and from me. That wicked servant knew what he was supposed to do and he did nothing. Many of us know what we're supposed to do, but we either disobey or delay. But in essence, both of those things are doing nothing. But today, we have a chance to change all that. Ben Hayden, in his famous book, Changed Lives, said this. Pay attention. I want to tell you something from observation, he says. I never met anyone who tithed that did not tend to be happy about the fact that he did. He was not just happy about tithing, but about a lot of other things. I never met anybody that tithed very long who ever gave it up. I also never met anyone who tithed who did not say at some time it had become very difficult for them. Extremely difficult. Generous people seem to be the happy ones. And miserly people seem to be the most unhappy ones. Boy, the misers are sure grumpy. Ebenezer Scrooge is our historic picture of this miser. And the critical spirit is with those who are not giving people. Just look around and you can tell. You know what that really is saying? The critical spirit is with the people that don't give. The people who don't give make the most racket and complain the most. That's what he's saying. Just look around, you can tell. Where's that coming from? Remember the other day? Following like a magpie. Where's the noise? Maybe we ought to get to the place where we say, well, look, if you're not offering God and returning to him the right percentage of your time, talent, and treasure as far as this church is concerned, we don't care what you think. I didn't intend to say that out loud. It just came out. But maybe we should just start looking at it like that. Oh, you got a complaint? What are you doing? You doing anything? No? Get step and start doing something and come back to me and complain about what you're doing. If you got a part on the team, it's a whole lot harder to complain about the rest of the team when you know you dropped the ball a time or two yourself. There's 5 biblical reasons why everyone should be a tither. Number 1, and most importantly, is obedience. In Genesis 14:20, you may not know this, but Abraham tithed before the law was even given to Moses. Tithing didn't begin with the law. Tithing began in time immemorial. And Abraham tithed the percentage of what God had given him before Moses even gave the law. And then Moses gave the law and demanded 1/10 of everything be returned to God. And then Malachi 3:20 clarifies that the law demanded everyone tithe of everything they had. Everything we have. Time, talent, and treasure. This is not a money sermon. I know I've used this possessions and financial resources idea a lot, but we're talking about your life. God commanded through the law that we return 1/10 of everything he's given us, and if everything is God's, then our time is God's, our talent is God's, our treasure is God's, and he has demanded that we return to him 1/10 of it. In Matthew 23:23, there are some people that say, oh, well, tithing is not a New Testament principle. How many of you heard this one? Oh, well, tithing's an Old Testament principle. It doesn't apply to the New Testament. That's hogwash. That's a lazy man's answer. Look at Matthew 23:23, where Jesus reminds everyone to tithe. He just talks about the motives behind doing it. And then in 1 Corinthians 16:2, it's indicated that God still expects his children to tithe in the church. So pre-Jesus, Jesus, post-Jesus, same rule. Stewardship. 10% of our income should be offered for the Lord's work through his church. The other 90% should be managed wisely because everything we do with that's a spiritual assessment upon our own lives. Next, honesty. Any thieves in here? We never raise our hands and say so. But you know what Malachi 3:8-10 teaches? It teaches that if we don't return 1/10 of all that we have back to God, we're stealing. We're robbing him. Now, isn't it unthinkable that a Christian would steal? That's unthinkable. We shouldn't have to lock our doors here. We should not have to lock our doors here. A person driving by in the middle of the night should be able to stop and come in here and pray because they need to approach the throne of God. The fear for doing that is somebody come here and clean us out. We've been broken into multiple times here. It's a tragedy to think that somebody would break into God's house and steal the stuff from his campus. But every time we fail to give 1/10 of our time, talent, and treasure, we're the thieves ourselves. Quit looking down your nose at the people that broke into the church. They're not claiming to be Christian. Those of us that do it every week are the ones that are guilty. We got to remind ourselves that we've got to tithe. because it's what an honest man does. We simply return what God's given it us to him. It already belongs to him anyway. It's the honest thing to do. Can I tell you the big one? The big one to me, love. It's love, man. It's a love thing. I say over and over and over again, look, God's not trying to get in your wallet, your calendar, your checkbook. He's trying to get into your heart. If he can get into your heart, all that other stuff will take care of itself. If he can change your attitude, everything else will change. You know what John 14:15 says? It says this. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. Period. You know what I believe? I believe we give the best gifts to the ones we love most. I believe that. Am I wrong? Am I wrong? We give the best gifts to the ones we love the most. But we know what they mean to us. Ask yourself, do I love God enough to give him my best? There's also gratitude. Psalm 116:12-14 reminds us that since we have received so much, we should be responding by giving much. We've received Jesus, his salvation, his presence, his blessings, and we will receive his heaven. How can we give him less than a tithe? Did you hear what I said? We received Jesus. Herein is love, that a man would lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends. Jesus laid his life down for me because he loved me. He gave everything he had to pull me out of everything I'd done and to put me in a position to where he could bless me with time, talent, and treasure. How dare I fail to show gratitude for his grace to me? How can I give him less than the small amount that he asked me for? And the last thing is faith. Listen, Shelly and I have been there. We know what it is to live hand to mouth. We know what it is to not know where the next meal's coming from. We know what it is to be, in the American sense of the word, poor and really not know how you're going to pay your bills. We know what that is. As good or better than anybody in this room. We lived a good period of years in that situation. I was a starving artist, literally. We know where that is. But God has promised that he would be faithful to us if we're faithful to him as his stewards. We are a living testimony to that. What I'm telling you is true. Malachi 3, Proverbs 3, Matthew 6, Luke 6, all of them say that faith in God's promises is reflected by obedience to his word. We're required to bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. You know what God says? I will respond. Test me now. But you got to give to get. I know that sounds terrible. You got to give something to bless. You got to give God something to bless. And here's the thing. Look at me. I'm not fussing at you. I've been there. I've really been there. And in times I'm there again and again. I told you I like stuff. I like stuff. I'm American. I like it. I'm a man and all that, but I love me some shoes. I got a closet with more shoes in it than most women have. I like stuff. Hear me on this. I got some shoes. I have more pairs of Adidas than most people have shoes. I like things. I get it. I'm with you. I'm not like preaching at you. We're sharing this time together. But possessions have a grip on our lives as Americans. They're leeching us. They are our identity. That's how we look around and say, look how cool I live. All our buddies say, man, he must be hitting a lick of a stick over there. And really, we can't play slip up in a slick place. You ever heard that one? That's a Bill Pritchardism. But God knows that possessions have this huge grip on our lives. So he says, look, okay, children, I know this is going to be hard for you. I know that it is. So here's what I'm going to tell you. Test me in it. Try me out. Taste and see if God ain't good. Test me in this. Try me. See what happens. I dare you to test me, he says. And I will open up for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you a blessing until it overflows. If you'll just test me, I know it's hard, but if you'll just trust me and test me, I will pour more in your lap than you can hold. It'll pour out of your cup and it'll wet your britches. That didn't sound good. You know what I meant. I want everybody to bow their heads for a second, but I want you to keep your eyes open. Because here's the thing. When it all comes down to it, really, I think tithing is an issue of trust, not money. I really believe that. I believe that our tithing is not an issue of trust. Money, it's an issue of trust. You've been given a pledge card, and there's 2 boxes on that pledge card. I know many of you tithe. Shelly and I and the family are not going hungry yet. I'm just kidding. We're not going hungry. Everything's okay. The lights are on. It's cool in here. I know that many of you already tithe. Some of you have been doing it for years, some of you have been doing it for months, some for weeks, but you tithe. If that's you, I just want you to check that box and say, man, I'm already a tither. You're preaching the converted here. I get that. But if you've not been tithing, but you're ready to act upon what you already know to be true, because we've all already said we know everything's God's, and if everything's God's, it goes without saying He can ask us to return some of it to Him. If we understand that, and you're in the place in your life today where you can say, okay, I'm ready to act on what I've already known, what I've already been taught, I'm ready to put God ahead of my possessions, I just want you to check the box that says, okay, as of today, I'll be a tither. I commit the first 10% of my income to the Lord through GBC, through Gum Branch Church. And then lastly, I want you to sign your name to it. And I want to give you some time to really think this through. Because as your pastor, I am really not after your money. This is not about money. If I really wanted to be in money, I wouldn't be in ministry. I can tell you that. But I do want you to be right with God. I want you to be obedient. I want you to be honest. I want you to express love. I want you to be grateful. I want you to have faith. And the only way to have those things is to meet God where He asks us to meet Him. So as you sign your name, I'm praying God's blessings on you as you do this, because here's what I want you to understand. If you choose to make this choice today, you commit this tithe to God, I want it to be based on the following truth. I want you to do it for these 3 reasons and these 3 reasons only. Number 1, I want you to do it because God owns everything. My tithe is return, not give. Why am I doing this? Because God is yours anyway. How dare I not give return a percentage of it to you? Don't sign your name if you can't say that's why you're doing it. Secondly, because God expects you to tithe. That's the second reason why I'm asking you to do this. And thirdly, because if you'll just meet God where He is, I promise you, He will meet your needs.